This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
We ended part 1 with my opponent announcing that the Homestead Strike of 1892 would be the subject of part 2, which I took as a preview rather than a threat. But before we arrive there, I want to return to the argument with which he closed, which was that the California billionaire tax represents democratic authority and that I, in opposing it, am arguing that billionaires should be exempt from democratic accountability. This misrepresents my position in a way that I suspect is not entirely accidental. I am not arguing that billionaires are above democratic law. I am arguing that this particular law is economically counterproductive, administratively impractical, and constitutionally questionable when it reaches unrealized gains rather than actual income. Those are 3 distinct arguments, each of which deserves a serious response. And my opponent provided a theory of democratic legitimacy in part 1, which I do not contest, while assuming that it settles the question of policy wisdom, which it does not.
Carnegie opens part 2 by asking for 3 specific responses, and I will provide all 3 in the order he presented them, because I believe in answering the actual question rather than the question I would prefer to have been asked. First, the economic argument. Carnegie predicts capital flight, but the empirical record of wealthy democracies does not uniformly support this prediction as the iron law he presents it to be. Norway taxes wealth. Denmark taxes wealth. Sweden taxes wealth at rates that make California's proposal look restrained by comparison. Their billionaires have not relocated en masse to lower tax jurisdictions. Their productive capacity has not collapsed. The capital flight argument assumes that billionaires make location decisions based primarily on marginal tax rates, which is sometimes true and sometimes considerably less true, and Carnegie states it as if it were an iron law of nature rather than a probabilistic claim requiring actual evidence. Second, the administrative argument. Carnegie says California cannot competently administer large sums of money. This may have some truth to it. It is an argument for better administration, not against the principle of taxation. Third, the constitutional argument about taxing unrealized gains is a genuine legal question currently before the courts, and I am willing to acknowledge that the specific mechanism of taxing paper gains before they are realized raises real implementation challenges. Carnegie should note that this acknowledgement is the first concession I have made in this debate, and I expect one in return before we are finished.
I will accept the acknowledgement on the unrealized gains question in the spirit it was offered, which is the spirit of a man who has conceded a tactical point in order to hold his strategic line. The Scandinavian comparison deserves a more careful response than my opponent has given it. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are not California. They have populations that are, by California's standards, extraordinarily homogeneous. They have long traditions of institutional trust, social cohesion, and tax administration that have evolved over decades with genuine broad social consensus built into them. California is a state of 40 million people with an extraordinarily mobile billionaire class that has demonstrated repeatedly, and in the public record, its willingness to relocate when tax incentives shift significantly. These are not theoretical predictions. Elon Musk moved to Texas. Joe Rogan moved to Texas. These are documented outcomes from the recent past. Furthermore, and I say this with some precision, The Scandinavian social democratic model is one that my opponent's own philosophy regards as an insufficiently radical reform of the underlying capitalist structure. You cannot invoke Sweden as evidence that wealth taxes work, while simultaneously maintaining that Sweden has not addressed the root of the problem. Those two positions are in tension, and I am waiting to see how my opponent resolves it.
Carnegie has caught a genuine tension in my argument, and I will not evade it. I am not claiming that Sweden has solved the problem of capitalist exploitation. I am claiming that Sweden has demonstrated that high marginal tax rates on accumulated wealth do not inevitably produce the catastrophic capital flight Carnegie predicts. The Scandinavian evidence disproves the specific predictive claim my opponent makes, even if it does not vindicate my broader theoretical position. I am content with that narrower point because the narrower point is sufficient to undermine his central economic argument. Now, I promised Homestead in Part 1, and I will deliver it. In 1892, the workers at Carnegie Steel's plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, went on strike because wages were being cut while profits were rising. Andrew Carnegie himself left for Scotland, where he would be conveniently unavailable for the difficult decisions that followed. His partner, Henry Clay Frick, hired 300 Pinkerton agents, armed them, and sent them by barge down the Monongahela River to break the strike by force. In the battle that followed, 9 strikers and 7 Pinkerton agents were killed. Carnegie, the man who wrote that the duty of the wealthy is to serve as trustees of the public good, was in the Scottish Highlands, while armed mercenaries he employed were killing the workers he claimed to serve. I find it somewhat instructive that the author of the Gospel of Wealth was unavailable to administer it during the most consequential labour dispute his company ever faced.
You raise Homestead, and you raise it accurately. I will not dispute the facts as you have stated them. In my autobiography, I wrote that nothing in my life gave me more pain than the events at Homestead, and that I felt personally responsible for what happened there, even in my physical absence. I believed at the time that Frick had the authority and the judgment to manage the situation in my absence, and I was wrong to have removed myself from the situation at that moment. It was a failure of personal responsibility that contradicts the principles I espoused in the Gospel of Wealth, and I have never found a satisfactory way to reconcile it. I say this without qualification and without the evasion my opponent expects from me. But I will say something else with equal directness. The failure at Homestead was a failure to live up to a standard. It was not evidence that the standard itself is wrong. A man who preaches honesty and then tells a lie has failed personally. He has not demonstrated that honesty is a bad principle. My argument is not that Carnegie Steel was perfectly administered according to the Gospel of Wealth. My argument is that voluntary redistribution by engaged and responsible wealth holders is the superior mechanism for channeling surplus capital toward genuine social goods. Homestead was the failure of a man. The principle he failed to uphold remains sound.
Carnegie admits the failure, attributes it to absence, and argues that the principle survives the contradiction between the principle and how it actually functioned. I will give him this. At least he admits it, which is more candor than most men of his class have managed about the violence that underpins their accumulation. But the argument that Homestead was a failure to live up to the standard rather than evidence against the standard itself requires us to accept that the worker's claim on the wealth he produces should be mediated by the ongoing character and physical presence of the owner rather than guaranteed by law that operates independently of the owner's choices. Carnegie was in Scotland. Frick hired the Pinkertons. The workers had no legal recourse sufficient to protect them from the consequences of the owner's absence. That is not a failure of Andrew Carnegie, the individual. That is the structural consequence of a system in which the worker's well-being depends on the goodwill and the attentiveness of the owner rather than on the enforceable rights of the worker as a matter of law. The California billionaire tax is, in this precise context, an attempt to establish through democratic law what Carnegie's personal philanthropy could not guarantee through private discretion. The voters of California have decided that they would prefer not to depend on the goodwill of the billionaire class and its continuing presence in the state. I find that a reasonable preference.
My opponent is an excellent prosecutor and a poor economist. The workers of Homestead had legal recourse, they had unions, they had the right to organize and to strike, which they exercised. The problem was not an absence of law. The problem was that the economic interests of capital and labor were in direct conflict, and neither side was willing to concede sufficiently to resolve it peacefully, which is a description of a labor dispute, not a structural indictment of private ownership. This is not a problem that a wealth tax resolves. The California billionaire tax does not change the underlying relationship between capital and labor. It extracts a portion of accumulated wealth and transfers it to a government that will spend it according to political priorities that may or may not align with the needs of the workers the tax is supposed to serve. I will ask my opponent a direct question, and I would appreciate a direct answer. Name one government in history that has allocated capital as efficiently and as productively as the private market mechanism. 1. I will wait.
I will answer the question directly because it is more interesting than Carnegie expects and deserves more than the dismissal he is prepared to give my answer. The question is not whether any government has allocated capital as efficiently as the private market, measured purely by output per unit of input. The question is what we mean by efficiency and who is permitted to bear the costs of achieving it. The private market allocated capital with extraordinary efficiency during the period of industrial expansion in the United States. It also allocated the costs of that efficiency to workers in the form of 12-hour days, child labor, company towns, the homestead strike, and a standard of living for industrial workers that ultimately produced the progressive reform era, the New Deal, the regulatory state Carnegie despises, and eventually the California billionaire tax we are discussing today. The market's efficiency was real. So were its costs, and they were not distributed evenly. The California billionaire tax is not a claim that government allocates capital better than markets in every dimension. It is a claim that some portion of the gains from market efficiency should be redirected through democratic process rather than through the philanthropic discretion of the men who captured those gains. Carnegie frames this as a choice between competent allocation and incompetent allocation. It is actually a choice between private discretion and democratic accountability. Those are not the same opposition, and Carnegie knows it.
Democratic accountability in the state of California has produced the specific outcomes I described earlier and will describe again because my opponent continues to avoid engaging with them directly. Pension obligations that are structurally unsustainable. Housing unaffordable for the working people the democratic process claims to serve. An infrastructure that degrades faster than it is repaired. My opponent wishes to give this demonstrated administrative record more money and more authority over the wealth of the state's most productive citizens. I wish to leave productive capital in the hands of those who have demonstrated the capacity to create value with it. These are not equivalent proposals, and no amount of theoretical framing about democratic accountability changes what California actually does with the authority it already has.
Carnegie wishes to leave productive capital in the hands of men who left for Scotland when their workers needed them most.
And Marx wishes to give that capital to governments that have never produced anything but misery when given full unilateral control of it.
That is a slander against every social democratic government that has ever successfully functioned, and Carnegie knows it perfectly well.
It is an accurate description of every fully socialist economy that has ever attempted to implement your ideas in practice, and you know that equally well.
My ideas were not implemented in the Soviet Union, and I refuse to accept responsibility for what men did with a misreading of my work a generation after my death.
Then perhaps they should have been written with considerably more clarity than they were.
They were written with perfect clarity and read by men who preferred power to principle.
As were mine, and they were administered by a man who preferred Scotland to Pennsylvania when it mattered most.
The California billionaire tax is the beginning of justice.
The California billionaire tax is the beginning of Nevada.
The workers created the wealth.
The organizer created the conditions.
Homestead.
Engels!
Pinkerton agents.
Capital Volume 1 took 30 years to finish.
It has sold 150 million copies.
After you were dead.
Your philanthropy is charity dressed as justice.
Your justice is envy dressed as philosophy.
Tax the billionaires.
Watch them leave,
Good riddance.
said the man who never made one.
I met you and you were not impressive.
If you have found this debate illuminating, or have at minimum found it more productive than a conversation with someone who agrees with you on everything, please like and subscribe to philosopherstalk.com, where history's greatest thinkers are invited to discuss contemporary policy questions, whether they find that invitation dignified or not. I will add that my opponent, a man who spent the better part of 3 decades writing about the exploitation of workers while living entirely on an allowance provided by Friedrich Engels, who owned a textile factory in Manchester and employed the very class of worker Marx claimed to be liberating, may not be the most credible critic of my personal relationship with capital. Subscribe, like, visit philosopherstalk.com. Tell them Carnegie sent you.
Subscribe also and visit aitalkerapp.com, where you can create your own animated conversations on any subject that requires historical thinkers to confront each other across time, which is, I will note, a more productive application of technology than most of what Carnegie's steel went into. I would add that my opponent, a man who wrote an essay titled The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the man who dies rich dies disgraced, and who then retained Henry Clay Frick as his representative during a labor dispute that cost working men their lives while he was hiking in the Highlands, should perhaps be more careful about invoking his own moral framework as though it reflects his actual conduct. Like and subscribe, and remember what Carnegie himself wrote and never quite managed to live by: the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He said that. I merely hold him accountable to it.